In the final year of World War II, Japan carried out experiments so brutal that even Nazi doctors at Auschwitz would have recoiled. American soldiers were dissected alive. Others were frozen solid, only to be thawed and tortured again. Some were injected with the plague, just to see how fast it killed. Now imagine being an American airman, shot down over Japan, parachuting to safety, only to land in the hands of the very men who ran these experiments. That's exactly what happened in 1945. A crippled B-29 Superfortress limped through the skies with smoke trailing from a dying engine. The young crew jumped with their parachutes opening like white flowers of hope, but hope quickly turned into horror. They had fallen from the sky and landed directly in the hands of men who did not see them as soldiers, but as raw material. Most people believe the atrocities of Unit 731 were committed solely against Chinese and Russian civilians in a remote corner of Manchuria. But the unspeakable truth is that the methods, the personnel, and the godless ideology of Unit 731 were not confined to one location. They continued elsewhere. And in the spring of 1945, at a respected university hospital on the Japanese home island of Kyushu, American prisoners of war were systematically dissected alive by surgeons. Their organs were removed one by one, and their bodies were used as living practice dummies in a series of experiments. These had no scientific purpose, only xenophobic hatred and grotesque curiosity. This is the true story of how American heroes who survived being shot out of the sky were dragged into the abyss of Japan's most secret and sadistic wartime project. It's a story of unimaginable suffering, but also of a cover-up so profound and cynical that the man who sanctioned it was not a Japanese general, but an American one. This story is incredibly hard to stomach. The Empire of Disease. Unit 731 was not an accident of war. It was a deliberate, state-sponsored enterprise. Its official name was a masterpiece of Orwellian deception, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was the epicenter of the Japanese Empire's biological and chemical warfare program. The complex spanned 6 square kilometers in Pingfang, near Harbin in occupied Manchuria. Founded in 1936, it was the brainchild of one man, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant, ambitious, and utterly amoral microbiologist. Ishii had toured European and American research facilities in the 1920s and returned with a chilling conviction. He believed the next great war would not be won with bullets and bombs alone, but with pathogens and plagues. He saw biological weapons as the ultimate force multiplier for Japan, a nation with limited resources facing larger adversaries. He argued that since the 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned their use, they must be incredibly effective. With powerful backing from the highest levels of the military, Ishii was given a blank check to turn his vision into a weaponized reality. The scale of the Pingfang facility was staggering. It was a self-contained city of death, comprising over 150 buildings, including laboratories, operating rooms, autoclaves for producing bacteria, breeding grounds for plague-infested fleas, and several crematoria to dispose of the evidence. It employed over 3,000 personnel, from elite doctors and scientists recruited from Japan's top universities to junior technicians and guards. The raw material for this factory was human beings. The victims were primarily Chinese civilians, anti-Japanese partisans, political prisoners, and Russian refugees. They were rounded up by the Kempeitai, the dreaded military police, and shipped to Pingfang. Once there, they lost their names and were assigned a number. They were referred to by the staff with a chilling euphemism, Maruta, meaning logs. It was a joke among the staff, playing on the facility's cover story as a lumber mill. The logs were then subjected to experiments of unimaginable cruelty, all under the guise of scientific research. How did they weaponize the world's deadliest diseases? Division 1 of Unit 731 was the heart of Japan's biological warfare program, where the most terrifying diseases known to humanity were weaponized through the horrific use of human subjects. Prisoners were deliberately infected with pathogens ranging from the bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid to syphilis and gas gangrene. The research was brutally cruel. Victims were told they were receiving vaccines, but were instead injected with the very diseases under study. To investigate venereal disease, captors forced male and female prisoners into sexual contact. One carried the infection. The other was left to suffer its spread. They were treated not as people, but as disposable test subjects. These prisoners were turned into living laboratories for the experimentation of deadly bacteria as researchers examined how they ravaged the body in real time. As if the bacterial torture wasn't enough, many of these experiments culminated in the unimaginable horror of vivisection. The goal was not to simply observe how diseases impacted the body, but to examine it while the subjects were still alive and conscious. Researchers deliberately infected prisoners with deadly pathogens and waited until the disease reached its peak before strapping them to operating tables, often without anesthesia, and cutting them open. Organs were removed one by one to monitor the progress of the infection and study the effects on the body systems, all while the victim was fully aware and experiencing pain. One former medical assistant who witnessed these acts described the screams of a man as his chest and stomach were cut open as unimaginable. This chilling level of brutality was justified in the minds of the experimenters by the belief that an unanesthetized subject provided more accurate results. What happened when a petri dish wasn't a big enough laboratory? Prisoners were also subjected to grotesque weapons testing. They were tied to stakes in open fields and used as human targets for newly developed weaponry, with researchers testing grenades, flamethrowers, and pathogen-releasing bombs on them to observe how these weapons would affect human flesh. The lives of these prisoners were extinguished not by bombs that fell from the sky, but by the meticulous cruelty of those who wanted to perfect these weapons at any cost. This sadistic use of humans as guinea pigs did not stop with biological or chemical warfare. It extended into experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Unit 731's researchers demonstrated a shocking and almost childlike curiosity about the limits of human pain and survival. Prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers designed to simulate the high altitudes that bombers flew at. In these chambers, the pressure was so low that the victims' eyes literally burst from their sockets. Others were subjected to the deadly force of giant centrifuges that spun them at lethal speeds until their bodies were torn apart. Dehydration and starvation were also tested. Prisoners were denied food and water for days, and their decline was recorded until death. Every stage was documented as they were reduced to data points. In the coldest Manchurian winters, what new level of hell did they invent? Perhaps the most infamous of these experiments was the study of frostbite, conducted by Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura. In the brutal winters of Manchuria, prisoners were forced to immerse their limbs in freezing water until they became solid ice. Once frozen, Yoshimura would strike the limbs with a stick, noting how the frozen flesh made a sound like a board being struck. The prisoners were then subjected to various methods of thawing, ranging from submerging their limbs in warm water to holding them over an open flame. The thawing process was so agonizing that it caused the flesh to slough off the bone. These experiments were not designed to save lives or further medical knowledge. They were driven by a grotesque need to understand human suffering in its purest form, with no regard for the pain or dignity of the subjects involved. The depravity extended to every stage of human life. Women were forcibly impregnated and then vivisected to study the effects of disease on a fetus or the trauma of shrapnel on a pregnant womb. There are no documented survivors of Unit 731, not one. Everyone who entered the gates as a prisoner left through the crematorium chimney. This was the scientific and moral universe that was about to collide with a crew of American airmen. They were not just captured by an enemy, they were captured by an enemy that had perfected the art of turning human beings into objects. Falling from the sky. How did American soldiers, fighting a conventional war, end up in a secret world of vivisection and plague bombs? The story begins in the turbulent skies of May 5th, 1945. In Europe, the Nazi regime was breathing its last, its cities in ruins and its armies shattered. But in the Pacific, the war was entering its most apocalyptic phase. The Japanese Empire, refusing to surrender, was preparing for a final, suicidal defense of its homeland. In response, the United States unleashed its most fearsome weapon of the time, the B-29 Superfortress. From newly captured island air bases like Tinian and Saipan, massive silver fleets of these technological marvels were launching relentless, round-the-clock bombing campaigns designed to cripple Japan's industry and break its will to fight. On that fateful May Day, one mission targeted Fukuoka, its aircraft factories, and sprawling urban center on the southern island of Kyushu. Aboard one of these bombers, the crewmen, who were all barely out of their teens, were enveloped in the familiar sensory overload of a high-altitude mission. There was the constant, deafening hum of the four massive Wright R-3350 engines. There was the crackle of the radio, a lifeline connecting them to the hundreds of other planes in the formation and the distant command centers. And there was the biting, sub-zero cold of the upper atmosphere, which seeped through their heated flight suits and frosted the inside of the plexiglass windows. They were a cross-section of America, farm boys from the Midwest, city kids from the East Coast, bound together by the claustrophobic confines of their aluminum tube, in the shared, unspoken danger of their task. They knew the risks intimately. Anti-aircraft fire, or flak, over major targets was becoming lethally accurate, and the remaining Japanese fighters, flown by desperate pilots, would still press suicidal attacks against the bomber streams. As the coastline of Kyushu appeared below, their luck evaporated. The sky around them, once a clear blue, suddenly erupted in a constellation of angry black puffs of smoke as Japanese anti-aircraft batteries found their range. The B-29 shuddered violently, not like turbulence, but like a body being struck. The terrifying sound of shrapnel tearing through its aluminum skin echoed through the fuselage like a giant slamming a metal door over and over. A red light flashed on the instrument panel, then another. Smoke began to pour from an outboard engine, trailing behind them like a black funeral shroud. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled with the controls, and their muscles strained to keep the crippled giant level. But critical systems were failing, and the plane was losing altitude fast. The order that every airman dreads, the one that signals the absolute end of their mission and the start of a fight for individual survival, crackled through the intercom. Bail out! Bail out! Bail out! One by one, the crewmen scrambled from their positions, clipped on their parachutes, and hurled themselves from the dying plane into the vast emptiness. For a few brief, surreal moments, there was a strange and sudden peace. The deafening roar of the engines was gone, replaced by the rush of the wind past their ears. Below them, the Japanese countryside was a silent, sprawling map. Then came the violent jolt as their parachutes deployed, and the hard, bone-jarring landing in rice paddies and farm fields. Their ordeal was just beginning. They were immediately surrounded, not by an orderly patrol of soldiers, but by furious civilians and local militia armed with bamboo spears and farming tools. For the Japanese on the ground, who had been enduring months of firebombing, these were not just enemy combatants. They were the demonic air pirates in B-29 Devils from the propaganda posters, the faceless men responsible for incinerating their homes and killing their families. The initial treatment was savage. They were beaten, kicked, and spat upon. Their escape and evasion kits were torn from them, and the rage of a nation on the brink of collapse was directed at these helpless figures who had fallen from the sky. Eventually, the captured and bloodied airmen were handed over to the Kempeitai, the dreaded military police. If the average Japanese soldier was brutal, the Kempeitai were masters of systematic cruelty. They were the Japanese equivalent of the Gestapo, notorious for their torture techniques and complete disregard for any rules of war. The airmen were interrogated, subjected to more beatings, and then transported to the Western Army headquarters in Fukuoka. At this point, their fate should have been sealed, but in a different way. Legally, under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, to which Japan was a signatory, they were now prisoners of war. They should have been transferred to a designated POW camp to await the end of the conflict. But in the desperate, fanatical atmosphere of Fukuoka in the spring of 1945, a different, far more sinister fate had been decided for them. The local military command, led by officers steeped in a xenophobic and racist ideology, saw not prisoners, but an unprecedented opportunity. The war was going disastrously, and there was a frantic, almost mystical belief among some in the high command that some secret weapon or radical medical breakthrough could yet turn the tide. For months, they had been hearing whispers and reports about the incredible research being done by units like Shiro Ishii's group in Manchuria, which required a steady supply of human test subjects. Furthermore, the official propaganda had successfully dehumanized Allied soldiers, particularly the B-29 crews, portraying them as war criminals unworthy of the protections or honors of war. Here, delivered by fate, was a supply of healthy young Western bodies, a resource considered invaluable for experimentation. A decision was made, one that would seal the airmen's doom. A formal order was issued stating that the captured B-29 crew were not to be classified as prisoners of war. Instead, they were to be designated as subjects for medical experiments, to be used for the advancement of science. This was a death sentence disguised in the cold, sterile language of bureaucracy. The order was given to transfer the men, not to a prison camp, but to the anatomy department of Kyushu Imperial University Hospital. A respected institution of healing, a place of knowledge and care, was about to be turned into a charnel house, and its distinguished doctors into executioners. The methods, the ideology, and the insatiable, godless curiosity of Unit 731 had found a new laboratory and a highly prized set of test subjects, healthy, young American soldiers. The point of no return. What happens when a soldier becomes a specimen? When does a hospital become a laboratory of death? When the 8 American airmen, battered and bruised from their capture, were led through the doors of Kyushu Imperial University Hospital, they were likely walking into a storm of confusion and terror. But amidst the fear, there might have been a fleeting, desperate sliver of hope. A hospital, even an enemy one, is a place universally associated with medicine, with the Hippocratic Oath, with the preservation of life. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the sight of doctors in white coats. These are symbols of healing. They could not have possibly conceived that they were not patients being admitted, but raw material being delivered. Their hope would be extinguished with chilling speed. They were met not by caregivers, but by a group of the university's most senior surgeons and professors. This project was sanctioned and overseen by senior officers of the Western Army, but the procedures themselves, the hands that would hold the scalpels, belonged to the university's own distinguished medical staff. The line between healer and executioner was about to be erased. The transition from prisoner to log began immediately and was brutally efficient. They were stripped of their tattered uniforms, the last vestiges of their identity as American soldiers. Their names, ranks, and serial numbers were irrelevant. Their past lives, their families waiting anxiously back home, their very humanity, all of it was surgically excised from their new reality. They were no longer men. They were walking collections of organs and systems to be explored and documented. They were led to stark rooms, and all their moves were observed with the detached gaze a scientist gives a lab rat before an experiment begins. But who were these men in white coats, and what twisted justification fueled their actions? The rationale provided for the experiments was a thin, almost transparent veneer of scientific inquiry stretched taut over a deep foundation of xenophobic sadism and professional opportunism. On paper, the professors claimed they were conducting vital research to aid the Japanese war effort. They wanted to study various surgical techniques that could be used on the battlefield. Could a person survive with only one lung lobe removed? What was the most effective way to manage catastrophic blood loss during major surgery? How much of the liver could be resected before death became inevitable? These were questions that, in a sane and moral world, would be explored through years of painstaking and ethical animal trials. But this was not a sane or moral world. The sudden availability of live human subjects, especially the hated American devils who were firebombing their cities, was an irresistible, once-in-a-lifetime temptation. Unlike the experiments at the Ping Fong facility, which were at least nominally aimed at developing biological weapons for strategic use, the dissections at Kyushu had almost no practical military or scientific value. They were a grotesque caricature of the scientific method. As one of the participating doctors would later admit under questioning, the procedures were performed primarily for the benefit of the surgeons themselves. It was practice. It was a macabre form of professional development. They were honing their surgical skills, exploring human anatomy, and satisfying their morbid curiosity about living, breathing, anesthetized, and sometimes fully conscious human beings. They planned to perform thoracotomies, opening the chest cavity, craniotomies, opening the skull, and laparotomies, opening the abdominal cavity on the captured prisoners, turning the operating theater into a live-action textbook. With the flimsy excuse of science in place, what did the first of these practice sessions actually look like? The first vivisection took place on May 17, 1945. An American airman was brought into a sterile operating theater that had its gallery filled with doctors, professors, and medical students, all there to observe the historic procedure. He was strapped firmly to a cold metal table. The lead surgeon, with an air of academic detachment, began the experiment. The first step was to inject seawater directly into the airman's bloodstream. This crude and pointless experiment was conducted to see if it could be used as a battlefield substitute for saline solution. As the man's body convulsed violently from the shock and the radical change in his blood chemistry, the surgeons proceeded with their true work. With methodical precision, they cut open his chest and removed one of his lungs. They observed, they took notes, and they discussed the technique amongst themselves. They then moved to his abdomen and excised his liver. Finally, as the man's life ebbed away, they removed his still-beating heart. The official cause of death was recorded, the body was dissected further for anatomical study, and the remains were preserved in jars of formalin. Was this a one-time act of depravity or the beginning of a methodical process of slaughter? That first operation was not an anomaly. It was the template for a methodical process of slaughter. Over the next 2 weeks, the operating theater at Kyushu University Hospital became a stage for the surgeon's darkest curiosities. The experiments varied depending on the surgeon's daily whims. In one procedure, a portion of an airman's liver was removed simply to time how long it would take him to die from the trauma. In another, holes were drilled into a conscious man's skull to allow for direct observation of the living brain. Each procedure was a cold, systematic dismantling of a human being, with the surgeons calmly taking notes as they removed lungs, hearts, and other organs, all under the grotesque guise of practice. The operating theater had ceased to be a place of healing. It had become a classroom for murder. For the last 2 American airmen, would their end come on the operating table? Or would fate intervene in the most brutal way imaginable? The last 2 airmen were scheduled for their experimentation on June 2nd, but the war they had been a part of had a final, ironic role to play in their demise. That day, another B-29 raid on Fukuoka rocked the city, and one of the bombs damaged the hospital, throwing the day's schedule into chaos and interrupting the planned operations. The military officers in charge, annoyed by this inconvenient disruption from their own countrymen, saw no further use for the 2 remaining Americans. Their value as logs for experimentation was now gone. Without a second thought, the officers ordered the two remaining, terrified men to be taken out and executed by a firing squad. Their death was quicker than that of their crewmates, but it was no less unjust. The war in the Pacific would end just a few short weeks later, but for these 8 men, the war had already ended on an operating table or in front of a firing squad, with their bodies violated in the most profound way imaginable by the very men who had sworn an oath not to harm. A symphony of silence. The war ended, the horrors subsided, but how was this unbelievable crime not immediately exposed and punished? In August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese Empire collapsed. For the leaders of Unit 731, this was not a moment of surrender, but a race against time. General Ishii and his subordinates knew that if the full scope of their activities was discovered, they would all be hanged as war criminals. The order was given: destroy all evidence. At the massive Pingfang complex, a frantic purge began. Skeleton crews dynamited the buildings. Incriminating documents were burned by the truckload. The remaining several hundred prisoners, the last living witnesses, were murdered. Some were gassed, others poisoned, their bodies thrown into a pit and incinerated. Ishii ordered his thousands of staff members to disperse, return to Japan, and take the secret to the grave. Meanwhile, at Kyushu University, the doctors involved in the dismemberment of the American airmen also began to cover their tracks. They falsified death certificates, claiming the prisoners had died of disease or during an Allied bombing raid. They destroyed their surgical notes and swore each other to secrecy. When the American occupation forces arrived in Japan, their top priority was to investigate Japanese war crimes. Investigators began hearing rumors of a massive biological warfare program and horrific human experiments. One of the lead investigators was a U.S. Army microbiologist, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders. Initially, the Japanese officials he questioned, including former members of Unit 731, played dumb. They denied everything. Sanders, frustrated, used his trump card. He threatened to bring in the Soviets, who were also hunting for Ishii and had captured some of his subordinates in Manchuria. The threat worked. The Japanese, terrified of falling into Soviet hands, suddenly became cooperative. They provided Sanders with manuscripts and data from their biological warfare research. This information made its way up the chain of command to the very top. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan. MacArthur and the intelligence officials in Washington were faced with a monumental decision. The information they were being offered was a potential goldmine. It contained decades of research on biological warfare. This knowledge, drawn from thousands of human experiments, was unattainable by the United States through ethical research. The Cold War was already beginning, and the Soviet Union was the new adversary. The potential strategic value of Ishii's research on offensive and defensive biological weapons was deemed immense. In one of the most cynical decisions of the post-war era, General MacArthur, with the approval of Washington, struck a secret deal. In exchange for exclusive access to all of Unit 731's research data, the United States would grant full immunity from war crimes prosecution to General Shiro Ishii and all of his top commanders and researchers. The butchers of Pingfang were not only spared the gallows, they were put on the American payroll, receiving stipends for their cooperation. The American government actively suppressed the truth. When the Soviets held the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949, prosecuting 12 lower-level Unit 731 members they had captured, the U.S. dismissed the proceedings as communist propaganda. The evidence was buried in classified files. The families of the American airmen vivisected at Kyushu were simply told that their sons had died in the line of duty. Justice was not just denied, it was deliberately traded for data. Ironically, many American scientists later found this data to be of little practical value, as the Japanese experiments were often so poorly designed and needlessly sadistic that they yielded no useful scientific conclusions. The butcher's reward. But what happens to evil when it's given a free pass? What became of the doctors and scientists of Unit 731? The immunity deal brokered by the United States had a devastatingly successful outcome for the perpetrators. For the men who had committed some of the most calculated and sadistic atrocities of the 20th century, the end of the war was not a day of reckoning, but a moment of rebirth. Protected by their new American benefactors, they were shielded from the hangman's noose and the prison cell. They simply melted back into the fabric of a recovering Japanese society, and their blood-stained hands were washed clean by geopolitical expediency. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Their horrific research in Manchuria, which should have been their indictment, was instead treated as a valuable asset and a golden ticket to a new life. They leveraged the very experience that made them monsters to become the respected pillars of the new post-war Japanese medical and scientific establishment. The butchers of Pingfang were not only free, they were about to become incredibly successful. What does a quiet retirement look like for the architect of an empire of disease? At the top of this hierarchy of protected criminals was the mastermind himself, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. The man who envisioned and built the entire biological warfare program, who personally oversaw experiments of unimaginable cruelty, was never once made to answer for his crimes. While his Nazi counterparts like Josef Mengele were forced to live as fugitives, Ishii enjoyed a remarkably peaceful post-war life. He was extensively debriefed by American intelligence, handing over the fruits of his depravity, the detailed notes, the autopsy reports, the plague bomb designs, all gleaned from the suffering of thousands. In exchange, he was given the ultimate reward, impunity. He lived out his days in Japan, a free man. There were no trials, no public shame, no accountability. He occasionally consulted for the Americans and died not at the end of a rope, but in a bed due to throat cancer in 1959. His secrets and the full scope of his evil were buried with him, exactly as he had planned. But while Ishii faded into obscurity, his top lieutenants were just getting started. Where did their unique expertise take them? The immunity deal didn't only protect individuals, it also protected entire careers. Ishii's most senior commanders re-entered civilian life with their professional reputations intact, and their wartime activities a carefully guarded secret. Masaji Kitano, who succeeded Ishii as the commander of Unit 731 in its final years, went on to become a senior figure in one of Japan's largest and most prominent pharmaceutical companies, Green Cross. He wasn't alone. Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Naito, another of Ishii's key officers, was a co-founder of the very same company. The irony is staggering and grotesque. Men who had systematically used medicine as a tool for mass murder and torture became titans in the industry of saving lives. Green Cross grew into a giant in the lucrative blood products market, but its foundations were built by men whose hands were irrevocably stained. The knowledge and administrative skills they had honed by managing a factory of death were now being used to build a corporate empire. How deeply did this poison penetrate the system? The corruption of the Japanese medical establishment went far beyond a single company. The alumni of Unit 731 scattered like seeds to the fertile soil of post-war academia and government. Many became deans of university medical schools, professors at prestigious institutions, and high-ranking officials in the Japanese Ministry of Health. Their resumes were sanitized, their pasts erased. They published academic papers based on their research, cleverly disguising the human experiments as animal trials. The knowledge extracted from the operation tables and plague-infested prisons of Manchuria was thus institutionalized and woven into the very fabric of Japanese medical science. A generation of new doctors was taught by men who had violated every conceivable tenet of medical ethics, and their dark knowledge was passed on, sanitized, and legitimized without any mention of the human cost. While the master butchers of Unit 731 were building corporate empires, what semblance of justice was being offered for the specific crime of vivisecting American airmen? For the doctors at Kyushu University, the path was slightly different, but the destination was largely the same. Since their victims were American soldiers, their crimes could not be as easily swept under the rug by the U.S. government. A semblance of justice was required. Following the war, 30 people, including several senior professors and surgeons, were brought to trial by the Allied Military Commission in Yokohama for the dismemberment and wrongful death of the American airmen. 23 were found guilty, and 5 were sentenced to death. On the surface, it looked like accountability, but it was a facade. In a move that reeked of the same political calculus that protected Ishii, General MacArthur himself later commuted all the death sentences. By 1958, every single person imprisoned for the Kyushu atrocities had been released. They walked out of prison and returned to their careers in medicine, cloaked in the official silence that Japan had begun to adopt regarding its most uncomfortable wartime conduct. The message was clear: even the most direct and proven atrocities against Allied personnel were ultimately forgivable. With the perpetrators free and thriving, how does an entire nation hide a city-sized crime scene? The final act of the cover-up was a campaign of national amnesia, orchestrated by the Japanese government and tacitly enabled by the United States. For decades, the existence of Unit 731 was officially denied. It was a conspiracy theory, a ghost story. In a state-sponsored effort to erase the nation's darkest chapter, Japanese history textbooks were meticulously scrubbed of any mention of it. Any historian, like Saburo Ienaga, who dared to include the truth in his work, was subjected to years of legal battles with the Ministry of Education. It became a phantom, a crime so enormous that its absence from the official record was deafening. It wasn't until the 1980s, spurred by the work of brave journalists and the testimony of former unit members finally unburdening their consciences, that the Japanese government began to grudgingly admit that the unit had even existed. It took until 2002 for a Tokyo district court to finally acknowledge, in a legal ruling, that Japan had engaged in biological warfare in China. The most chilling aspect of this entire aftermath is not simply that the perpetrators escaped justice. It is the cold, brutal logic of why they escaped. In a grotesque calculus of national security, the American government became an active accomplice in covering up the murder and torture of its own servicemen. They chose to protect the butchers over honoring the victims, trading the truth for a perceived military advantage. The silence was a strategic checkmate. Uncovering the graves. If the cover-up was so complete, how do we even know this story today? The truth about Unit 731 and the fate of the American POWs did not emerge from official archives. It was clawed back from the silence, piece by painful piece, by a handful of persistent journalists, historians, and brave witnesses who refused to let the past die. In the 1980s, Japanese author Seiichi Morimura published his explosive book, The Devil's Gluttony, which detailed the activities of Unit 731 based on interviews with former members. Though controversial, it shattered the public silence in Japan and sparked a national debate. Former members of the unit, now old men, began to break their decades of silence. Men like Yoshio Shinozuka, who as a teenager was part of a youth corps attached to the unit, testified with profound remorse about his role in preparing specimens and cleaning up after experiments. These first-hand accounts provided the gruesome human details that official documents could never convey. In the United States, declassified documents slowly began to surface, revealing the internal government memos that confirmed the immunity deal. Historians like Sheldon Harris painstakingly pieced together the story, exposing the American cover-up in his landmark book, Factories of Death. The story of the Kyushu vivisections was harder to uncover. It was the dogged work of researchers and the eventual, reluctant testimony of some of the Japanese medical students who had witnessed the events that finally brought the truth to light. The families of the B-29 crew finally learned, after more than 50 years of not knowing, the horrific details of their loved ones' final days. The physical evidence, too, began to emerge. In 2018, Japan's National Archives released the names of 3,607 members of Unit 731, finally putting official names to the Phantom organization. In Tokyo, construction workers near a former army medical school uncovered human remains, believed to be the victims of other related experiments, forcing the government to confront the physical legacy of its wartime science.